Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm very pleased you could join us today. And a special welcome to those who are joining us on our YouTube channel. Today we welcome James Conroy to tell us about his new book, Lincoln's White House, The People's House in Wartime. Our partner in presenting the program is the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, and we thank them for their support. After the question and answer period, Mr. Conroy will sign books outside the shop, one level up in this building. Before we hear about the public and private life in the Civil War White House, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up this month in this room. On Friday, November 18th at noon, we'll hear from Talmadge Boston, whose new book is Cross-Examining History, A Lawyer Gets Answers from the Experts About Our Presidents. Boston interviewed presidential insiders to get insights about America's past that can help us better understand our present situation and provide a more informed expectation about our future. And I think we all need that right now. And then on Wednesday, November 30th at noon, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Steve Toomey will tell us about his new book, Countdown to Pearl Harbor, 12 Days to the Attack. To learn more about these and all of our programs and exhibitions, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online, and there are copies in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive this by regular mail or email, and you'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. A few blocks away at the Ford's Theater Center for Education and Leadership, you can see a 34-foot tall tower of books representing the wealth of information published about Abraham Lincoln. The resources behind those thousands of books are preserved in both government archives and private manuscript collections. In the National Archives alone, we have hundreds of thousands of records pertaining to Lincoln's administration from both the military and civilian components of the executive branch, as well as from the legislative and judicial branches. Letters, telegrams, treaties, photographs, political cartoons, and maps all document this pivotal and transformational time in our nation's history. President Lincoln was making the decisions documented in those records. The White House teemed with activity. Since its construction, the Executive Mansion has been both family home and hub of government. The wartime White House was filled with friends, aides, officials, and favor seekers. The written record left behind by those who walked those halls allow us a glimpse of day-to-day life for the Lincolns and their associates. Having examined those records, today's speaker, James Conroy, will guide us through the mansion doors and into the public and private spaces that surrounded Lincoln and his family. James Conroy is an elected fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society and has been a trial lawyer in Boston for more than 30 years. In addition to Lincoln's White House, he is the author of Our One Common Country, Abraham Lincoln and the Hampton Roads Peace Conference of 1865, which was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize for 2014. Conroy served on Capitol Hill in Washington as a House and Senate aide in the 1970s and early 80s and earned his JD degree from Georgetown University Law Center in 1982. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome James Conroy.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. Given that there were 34 feet of Lincoln books at Ford's Theater, I hope there's now 34 feet and 1 inch. I've been told that there are 13,000 books on Abraham Lincoln, and having written 2, I think any author has to have an explanation for himself or herself for going down that road. I thought long and hard about my second book, having written the first, and came to the realization that of all those books, no one had ever written one specifically on what it was like to live and work and be entertained and do business in Lincoln's White House. I have tried to fill that gap with a kind of a time machine approach to it in an effort to bring it alive and make people see and understand what it was actually like to be there. So the first reason was sort of sheer curiosity along those lines. And the second reason, as I delved into the material, was to develop three themes that I think are reflected in the book. The first is, in the title itself, The People's House, which is what Lincoln often called it, basically transforming the White House into a platform for as close to direct democracy as I think we've ever gotten in this country, with direct public access to the president, which we'll see as we go through. The second was as a platform for racial progress, and we'll talk about that as we explore the subject. And the final was to use the White House as a platform for the war, as a rallying point and a political rallying as well as military rallying point for the war. So with that, I think we should just begin. I should say, echoing the introduction, that the archives, in fact, played a major role in the material that makes up the book, largely with the assistance of Karen Needles of the Lincoln Digitalization or Digitalizing Process project, and I have to express my thanks for that. Many of the images come from the White House Historical Association, and you'll know them when you see them, but some of them are colorized black and white Civil War photography produced by a website called Civil War in Color, which I highly recommend. And almost all of the rest come from the Library of Congress, many of them restored to be sharper and clearer to 21st century eyes. I think we should begin a discussion of Lincoln's White House with Lincoln's White House. This is a photograph restored by Derek Jensen, taken during Lincoln's time. And as I say in the beginning of the book, Lincoln's White House, I think, is fair to say, is both strange and familiar. It's familiar in the sense that we know the White House. It's the same White House in general form. We walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, we see that building. But it is also strange, and if you look a little more closely, you'll see some of that strangeness. There is no Washington Monument behind the building, as you would see in a photograph today. There is no East Wing, there is no West Wing. The building stands alone, with the exception of a glass conservatory that we'll talk about in a few minutes. That circular walkway is a gravel path, not the carriageway, which is out of sight both left and right. In the center of it is not a fountain as there is today, but what one Lincoln aide just from Illinois referred to as a moldy old Indian just dug up, which in fact was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson now stands in the old House chamber in the Capitol building. I think you'll see the shrubbery around the Jefferson statue is not particularly impressive. And it's worth noting, I think, that the windows on this summer day when the photograph was taken are open. And one has to imagine what it would be like on a humid August in Washington with those windows open. The alternative with no screens was not attractive. One of Lincoln's aides wrote a letter to his fiancée on a hot Sunday night. The gas lights over my desk are burning brightly, and the windows are open, and all bugdom seems to have organized a storming party to take the gaslight. It is only just possible to endure. The air is swarming with them. They are on the ceiling, the walls, and the furniture in countless numbers. They are buzzing about the room and butting their heads against the window panes. They are on my clothes, in my hair, and on the sheet I am writing on. Something different than what we would be seeing in the White House today. The statue of Jackson in Lafayette Square had been built some years before Lincoln's time. A British novelist by the name of Anthony Trollope, who'll be familiar to many of you, was not impressed with Washington in any way, and nor was he impressed with the statue. He wrote a letter home to a friend saying that the horsemanship is absurd and the rider is manifestly drunk. Surely the time must come when this item at least will be removed. The rear view, the southern exposure of the White House, also from a photograph of the 1860s. You can see the conservatory off to the left, and we'll speak about that in a moment. The children on the lawn have drawn speculation along the lines of Tad and Willie Lincoln and their friends, but no one really knows for sure. The wall in the foreground was known as Jefferson's Wall, having been built under Jefferson's direction, and you can see the graffiti underneath it, which was not a phenomenon confined to our own time. In the conservatory, this photograph was taken of some of the Plains Indians chiefs who came to basically a diplomatic event in the East Room with Lincoln. You can see the European diplomats to the left standing behind them, their wives standing in the middle, one of the children at the center standing behind the Indians. In the center is George Nicolay, Lincoln's private secretary, who we'll talk about in a moment, and who wrote the Bugdom letter. And standing to the right is Mrs. Lincoln. We don't have time in this presentation to talk in depth about the aftermath of this visit, but suffice it just to say that Lincoln gave peace medals to all of those chiefs, as well as certificates of friendship, and 3 of them were shot from their horses and killed about a year and a half later by Colorado militia outside a Cheyenne village that was flying an American flag. Lincoln had given them a lecture in the East Room about the white man being less warlike in his ways than his red brothers. This is an overhead drawing of the President's Park, as it was called at that time in the late 1850s. And those of you who, well, you all know Washington. Typically, I say in my presentations, those of you who know Washington, will see that some of it is aspirational and some of it is representational. The Treasury Department on the right was actually built. The corresponding War Department, State Department on the left never was. But the White House in the center, surrounded by those sculpted gardens, you can see Lafayette Square ahead of it, and the scant development in the housing immediately adjacent to the President's Park. Jefferson's Wall is along this area here, and beneath Jefferson's Wall is essentially a large unkept junkyard, literally consisting of abandoned junk, trash, piles of lumber, where the president would take some of his young aides down and test new weapons, firing them into the lumber pile. This is the old State Department, which you can see the Treasury Department behind it, which is still there today, of course, and has now been extended into that space where the State Department was. And the War Department on the opposite side. Those of you who have read a great deal about Lincoln will know that he spent hours every day at the War Department, walking over from the White House to check for news from the front at the War Department Telegraph Office. This shot is taken roughly from where the Holocaust Museum is today. I guess you could get a parking space on the mall in those days. The White House is here, Treasury Department here. The half-built stub of the monument would be just about here. 15th Street along this way, and off in the distance you can see the mountains. Gives you some sense of the absolute lack of development there, and the canal running along there, just along Constitution Avenue, which of course would be over here. This map is an 1861 map of the city and the President's house. And I wanted to draw your attention to the canal, which then existed where Constitution Avenue is today, and connected to the Potomac River here. Regrettably, the canal had been dug some decades earlier as part of a commercial venture which failed, and had therefore become totally dank, stagnant, unused. And you can imagine dank, stagnant water on an August day in Washington and the effect that that would have on the President's house within a stone's throw of it. John Hay, one of Lincoln's aides, which we'll talk about in a moment, once wrote a letter to a friend saying that he was composing it with the ghosts of 20,000 dead cats coming in from the canal. Here, the south front of Lincoln's White House again. This is an earlier shot, but identical to it. Very little changed from today other than Truman's balcony. And I draw your attention to what they called in those days the basement, this sort of ground floor level on the south side, which slopes up to a basement front on Pennsylvania Avenue. The basement, one of Lincoln's aides, smelled like something on the edge of a swamp. Rat infested. They brought in a ferret, Lincoln was told, to kill the rats, upon which Lincoln suggested that ferrets might be sent around to all the buildings in Washington, which were full of rats. The floor plan for the basement is here, and what is now the diplomatic reception room was the coal-fired furnace. The book goes into some detail about the actual systems in the White House, the plumbing, the gas, and the heat, all of which were state-of-the-art. There were several flush toilets, hot and cold running water. Lincoln performed many unpresidential tasks while he was living there, one of which was to go down in the basement with a monkey wrench and fix the pump that had broken down with the help of an Army captain. This is the scullery adjacent to the kitchen, which is still in the place where the kitchen is today. The fire in the stove, they had said, had not gone out since John Adams' day. The floor plan for the ceremonial ground floor is very little changed from what you would see today. The main exception being the interior servants' stairway that Lincoln liked to use, because you could go up and down without anybody seeing him, and the Porter's Lodge, which was the headquarters, if you will, of Edward McManus, a very short, 5'2", Irish-born character who amused the guests and the residents alike whenever he had the opportunity. He had a 6'4" assistant. So the two of them, kind of a Mutt and Jeff team, they would look out this little window here to see who was coming up the steps, if there was someone expected or some reason to be alert. And between them, Edward McManus and his assistant, Burns, made the entirety of the White House security staff in 1861 when Lincoln became president of the United States on the edge of a civil war. A reception in the East Room is superficially attractive. In fact, however, the White House in Lincoln's day was tawdry. These are the adjectives of contemporaries, not mine. Tawdry, ill-kept, dilapidated, rickety, creaky, dirty, full of greasy handprints on the wallpaper, tattered curtains, threadbare rugs, not to mention souvenir hunters who would come in and carve patches out of the sofas and take away tassels and soft finials off the chairs, things of that nature. The more interesting of the two floors, I think, is the upper floor, because it really is quite different from what we have today. The president's bedroom here, his dressing room, Mrs. Lincoln's adjoining bedroom, the library, and then the president's anteroom, his waiting room, and his office. The office is what we call today Lincoln's bedroom. Never was Lincoln's bedroom. It's used as a bedroom today with some Lincoln furniture, but was always the president's office and had been for many previous presidents. His private secretary's office adjoining, a little room that Richard Nixon used to use as a private study. Over here, the office of John Hay and William Stoddard, the two junior aides, we'll talk about in a moment. The bedroom of Nicolay and Hay, who were live-in help, which was not a perk but a burden, since the president would wander in at 1 or 2 in the morning, either to tell stories or read to them or perhaps to do business. This is a photograph taken of Lincoln in his office. which was very rare in those days. If you think about it, you'll never see, or almost never see, an interior photograph from the 1860s. This one required rigid posture for a long exposure. You can see behind the wallpaper that has since been replicated, the stand-up desk that Lincoln used pushed up against an interior door, and he's standing at the end of the cabinet table, which we'll see in a different shot soon, where the cabinet met in his office, generally twice a week, which had always been the venue for cabinet meetings. The substance of this contemporary cartoon is not particularly relevant, an anti-war cartoon, but whoever drew the cartoon had been in Lincoln's office. This is exactly how someone would have seen the President of the United States, with his leg thrown over the back of a chair, sometimes lying on two chairs with his feet up on a table, sometimes on the couch, looking like he didn't have a care in the world, as one aide said, in extraordinary, eccentric postures more often than not, sitting at his writing table with books, papers, a wastebasket underneath, very much like you would have seen had you come into his office in the 1860s. This front view of the White House is also contemporary to Lincoln's time, and the cobblestones you see there represent the only one of two cobblestone streets in the city of Washington at the time. You can see the trolley tracks as well, the horse-drawn vehicle that came down Pennsylvania Avenue. The dirt streets that surrounded it emptied into Pennsylvania Avenue whenever it rained, as you know it does often with cloudbursts here. And when that occurred, one of the newspapers said the mud was too thick to walk on and too thin to swim in. But the advantage was that because of the cobblestones, you could at least touch bottom there, as you couldn't do in many of the other streets. The people standing in front of the White House could have walked through the gates and into that door anytime they chose to do so, with very few exceptions. There was a literally open door policy with no restraints at all on anyone who chose to walk in there. One British journalist was told by an American, being astonished to see this, that the people paid for the president's house, the people paid the president to live there, and they had the right to go in there and see them if they chose to. The British author said, the White House is not the president's house, it is not even his own house. Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of many contemporary celebrities who are discussed and quoted in the book, once visited Lincoln's White House in the company of some Massachusetts whip makers who had come to present him with an ivory-handled whip, and talked about being joined without invitation by hangers-on who were just loitering in the vestibule, saw somebody famous, which he was at the time, latched onto his group, and by the time they got up to Lincoln's office on the second floor, he said, we made a very miscellaneous assortment of company, but all having an equal right to look our head servant in the face. In addition to these open doors, there were weekly levees, as they were called, or receptions, generally between New Year's Day and Lent. And anyone who chose to do so could line up and shake the president's hand at the end of that reception line. You can see his aides, Nicolay and Hay, standing off to the left there. Mrs. Lincoln, a lady bowing or curtsying to her, and the president shaking hands. It would not be unusual for him to shake 1,000 hands in a single night. And at the open houses that were held on New Year's Day, it could often be 2,000 or 3,000 that the president would shake on a given day, having to massage his hand for 15 or 20 minutes afterwards so that he could use it again. So then we come to the staff. This is John George Nicolay, who went by the name of George, 29 years old, an Illinois newspaper man who had been born in Germany of illiterate farmers there who emigrated to Illinois when he was a small child. He became attached to the family of a paper called the Free Press in Pittsfield, Illinois. As I say in the book, in sort of typically Dickensian fashion, he had been orphaned as a young boy. The family took him in, and he started at the paper as a printer's devil, doing odd jobs, worked his way up to a writer, an editor, and eventually actually bought the newspaper before he followed Lincoln to the White House. The assistant private secretary, John Hay, is, I think, my favorite character in Lincoln's White House. He was 22 years old at the time. Another Illinois resident had been a law apprentice in the adjoining office to Lincoln's in Springfield, Illinois. And the son of a doctor, well-to-do family, went to Brown when there were 200-odd students and 11 faculty there, had been class poet at Brown, and just a brilliant, witty young man, great conversationalist. Someone once said of Hay that you couldn't speak to Hay for more than 20 minutes without taking away something wonderful that you couldn't wait to share with your friends. And Hay would say these things and somehow manage to attribute them to you, so that, as this newspaper man said, you would go away not only impressed with Hay, but inordinately well pleased with yourself. Another less friendly newspaper man, critical of Hay's youth and rosy cheeks, said that he was very much a ladies' man, but with a suitable change of garb could have passed as a lady's maid. The third staff member, William Stoddard, 25 years old, also an Illinois newspaper man, although born in upstate New York. Stoddard was put in charge of correspondence at the White House, wrote 3 memoirs about his experiences there, a terrific writer, another very entertaining, funny young man. He said that he quickly learned as chief of Lincoln's correspondence that the moment a man goes clean crazy, he sits down and writes a letter to the President of the United States. He tells us that they got a letter every week from the angel Gabriel, who had not learned to spell in heaven. Stoddard had on his correspondence desk a series of pigeonholes with various categories in the pigeonholes, one of which was labeled crazy and poetry. So these 3 young men, 29, 25, and 22, comprised the entirety of Lincoln's administrative staff. Clerical, administrative, professional, that was it, until later in the war when a couple of substitutes were brought in on a kind of a makeshift basis. This is a shot of the gut renovation that was done at the White House in 1949, 50, 51. Some of you will know about this, others probably won't. But Truman found that the building had dilapidated to such an extreme degree and was basically falling apart inside that they literally gutted it out to the brick walls. But before they got that far, this shot was taken from the site of Lincoln's office. And if you see the beams off to the left there that divide this area, that entirety here is all of the space that the president and his aides occupied in Lincoln's White House. This is the office of Stoddard and Hay, the bedroom of Nicolay and Hay. Lincoln's office was here, and adjoining it, Nicolay's office. That's it, the entirety of the administrative staff in the 1860s in the midst of a civil war. Mary Lincoln, I don't have time to give justice to. I will say only that the word complicated is the single word that comes to mind. A terrific wife and mother, probably the greatest accomplishment of her time as First Lady was the floor-to-ceiling, roof-to-basement renovation of a White House that needed it very badly. Unfortunately, the flip side of that is the extravagant cost of that renovation, again, in the midst of a civil war. Congress appropriated $20,000, which was serious money in those days, for a 4-year term for all redecoration, refurbishments, furnishing, and the rest. Mrs. Lincoln spent $27,000 in the first month or so in that renovation, which got her into difficulties that the book explores in depth. Among those purchases was this carved mahogany bed, which is now in the Lincoln bedroom. Before she bought it, she said the best piece of furniture in the house was a bedstead that had been split down the middle, and that there was not a stick of furniture in the house that she would have put in her Springfield home. The china and the glassware is an interesting story in itself. Mrs. Lincoln bought almost 400 pieces of china and 700 pieces of hand-cut glass, replacing what they say was insufficient matching unshipped china for a dinner party of 12 in the White House formal dining room. This is an actual bill found by Karen Needles, who sits here with us, as part of this Lincoln document project in cooperation with the archives, which is in typically exquisite handwriting with a jaw-dropping number at the bottom for this china that we've just talked about. Lincoln's office, as it was in the time of Buchanan, his immediate predecessor, Lincoln made almost no changes to it when he came into the office, replaced that large bookcase on the left with maps, but otherwise left it almost completely the same. A congressman who visited it soon after Lincoln was elected said that it looked to him like the breaking up of a hard winter. Completely run down. The furniture, although it dated back to John Adams, was said by one newspaper to be too rickety to venerate. You can imagine the scent of cigars, constantly stale cigars infused into the curtains and the drapes, just a kind of a very hard scrabble place. Mrs. Lincoln transformed it as part of her renovation, as this painting by Peter Waddell shows, with the half-finished stub of the Washington Monument behind it. You can see the gas link coming down from the chandelier to the lamp, and really a quite attractive space. This is a tableau from the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois, of a cabinet meeting in Lincoln's office from two directions. I think perhaps that cabinet member in the corner is looking over the budget for Mrs. Lincoln's renovation. The fireplace is still there today in the Lincoln bedroom. Seward, I'll just briefly touch on the two most famous cabinet members. William Seward, who was closest to Lincoln, the typical aristocrat, didn't care what he looked like, didn't care about the frayed collars and the suit that he'd worn in college. One of the newspaper men said that when he came out with the European diplomats with their feathers and decorations and sashes, he looked like a molting barnyard fowl among a flock of peacocks. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, was known to be a bullet-spitting, tough individual that no one enjoyed visiting. Young John Hay wrote a letter to Nicolay asking him to stop telling people that I can get favors from Stanton. He said, I would rather make the tour of a smallpox hospital. Willie and Tad Lincoln there with their uncle. Willie is the older of the two boys. Again, I don't have time to go into the interesting story of Willie and Tad, other than to say that Willie was a studious, kind of serious boy, collected railroad timetables and would plot imaginary trips from one part of the country to the other. Tad, on the other hand, was said by a United States senator to be more numerous than popular. Among other things, he would beat a drum, blow a horn in his father's office in the middle of a cabinet meeting, to which his father would ask him to please tone it down as opposed to leaving the room. John Hay said he was perfectly lawless, with a poor opinion of discipline and no opinion of books. The older son, Lincoln's son, Robert Lincoln, was at Harvard when he was president for most of his time, and therefore only made some quick visits occasionally to the White House. Did become a captain in the Army toward the very end of the war and served on Grant's staff in that capacity. Actually witnessed the surrender of Lee at Appomattox. We come now to a caricature, contemporary at the time, called Gulliver Abe in the White House, attacked by the Lilliputian office seekers, which pretty much speaks for itself. There were 1,500 federal jobs available when Lincoln became president. The White House was mobbed with literally thousands of people coming in looking for those jobs. Lincoln would actually interview most of them individually. You can see them here in the waiting room. Off to the left is the door to Nicolay's office. To the right is the door to Lincoln's office. Lincoln would actually interview doormen at the level of a doorman. There's one passage in the book about a very simple man who came in and asked for that job. Lincoln said, well, do you have any experience as a doorkeeper? And he said, well, no actual experience, Mr. President. Lincoln said, well, do you have any theoretical experience? And he said, well, no, I'm afraid I don't. Well, have you read any books on the principles of doorkeeping? Have you studied the ethics of doorkeeping? Well, no, Mr. President. Well, don't you see, my good fellow, you're utterly unqualified for this job? And they say the man left almost happy after having this little conversation with the president. Herman Melville, who had written a book about a whale that had failed, was one of those job applicants, tried to get a job as consul to Florence, and was turned down, refreshingly enough, in favor of an actual diplomat. We then come to the beginning of the war. I've got to move quickly through this material, but we had troops camping out in the East Room, which John Hay said was probably the most luxurious barracks in the history of the American military. They also rustled up some amateur fighters from Kansas who were in town looking for jobs, pot-bellied congressmen, nearsighted judges, people who had just wandered in hoping to find some employment. One of those groups called themselves the Stranglers Brigade, and Lincoln apparently said that he didn't think any of them had actually strangled anybody. They were relieved in due course after a very tough week or 10 days of anxiety by actual disciplined troops, including these fire zouaves from New York. You can see this one standing on a Confederate flag. And in July, or in June, it was July, I guess, two dozen regiments of New York infantry militia marched by the White House, Lincoln under the tent with his staff and his generals. And I show this as just a visual impression of the way he used the White House for this purpose. He spoke to regiments outside on the lawn as they were coming and going to battle, and would rally the troops, rally his officers, bringing them to the White House and showing the public that there was strength there and that the Union would indeed survive. I show you this photograph because you see the, painting, modern painting. You see the two sentries pacing in front of the north portico, Pennsylvania bucktails they were called, with deer tails on their hats. But as one of them said, both the infantry sentries and the cavalry sentries who stood at the gates mounted on black horses were more decorative than useful. No one was stopped by any of these soldiers. If you came up to that portico, you walked right in, you went up the stairs, you sat in the waiting room, and eventually Lincoln would see you, whoever you were, whatever your business was, or might not be for that matter. Some of those troops encamped behind the White House on the south lawn. You see the bucktails on their hats. Tad loved to hang out with them and come home full of campfire soot, much to his mother's dismay. But they pretty much adopted Tad as the colonel of the regiment. They had a uniform made for Tad, and Tad had himself photographed with all of the gravity of General McClellan, and from that point forward signed his letters, Colonel Tad Lincoln. There was a grand party held. This is not the party itself, but it's something like you would have seen at that party in 1862 by Mrs. Lincoln, which was considered in very bad taste, not only because people were dying and starving, or not starving, but suffering privation out in the field while this grand, lavish party was held. One newspaper man said it was like having a ball with a coffin in the house. The dresses here at the Lincoln Library and Museum, most of which were composed of up to 25 yards of silk, supported by whalebone and iron underpinnings, which one general said Mrs. Lincoln could deploy to save herself from an attack just by organizing her ladies-in-waiting. Regrettably, this tableau in the Lincoln Museum shows Willie Lincoln came down with typhoid fever that very night in the middle of this party and survived the night but died a couple of days later. Mrs. Lincoln was thrown into mourning not only by the loss of her son, but also by what she described as God's punishment of her for the sin of pride. There were several seances held in the White House after that. The evidence is good that Lincoln attended at least one or two of them himself. Seances, spiritualists were very popular at the time, and they were held in the Red Room with con artists of all sorts, basically trying to persuade Mrs. Lincoln that they were in touch with her son. We don't have time at all to get into anything like the depth that's in the book, but Lincoln did make a racial platform out of the White House. This is Frederick Douglass, who was the most famous abolitionist of his time, of course, the runaway slave. Not only did Lincoln have Douglass at the White House several times to consult with him about the recruitment of black soldiers, but also local black clergymen, leaders of the black community of all stripes, which is utterly unheard of at the time and considered not only a breakthrough, but a scandalous breakthrough in the Washington, D.C. of the 1860s. On the entertainment plane, we're zipping through this pretty quickly, but the entertainment that was held at the White House, very much like it is today with the great celebrities of the day who entertained there. These are the Hutchinson family singers, very popular at the time. You can see their names under each of their portraits, sort of like John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Herman the Prestidigitator was the great magician of his day who performed in the Red Room for the Lincolns and their guests. P.T. Barnum and Tom Thumb, General Tom Thumb, was the greatest star of American stage at the time. Both came to the White House. Mrs. Lincoln had a reception for Tom Thumb and his new bride soon after their wedding. Walt Whitman was a regular visitor to the White House, befriended John Hay as a fellow poet. Julia Ward Howe, the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, recited her essays for the Lincolns and their guests. Ralph Waldo Emerson visited with Seward, was brought into Lincoln's office and conned out of 25 cents by Willie and Tad. So we come to almost to the end of this presentation. When Lee surrendered in April of 1865, a spectacular celebration was staged in the President's Park. There were fireworks. Before the fireworks, Stanton had arranged to have a man with a candle standing at every window of the War Department, the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the White House. And when a band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner, a man with a match at each of those windows lit the candle. And suddenly all the windows were ablaze with light. People were astonished. There were rumors about electricity, something that people talked about for days thereafter. And then, as we know, unfortunately enough, Lincoln's assassination took place just a few days after Lee's surrender. You can see the black crepe on the pillars of the north portico. The funeral was held in the East Room, very much like the JFK funeral 100 years later. In fact, Mrs. Kennedy had those records pulled out of storage, probably from the archives, and replicated Lincoln's funeral in as much detail as they could. I want to close with a little piece of the epilogue that talks about what happened to the members of Lincoln's staff and the others associated with Lincoln's White House. This is John Hay in 1865 on the left, and John Hay in 1903 as Secretary of State for Teddy Roosevelt. A spectacular career. There aren't too many people, I think, that can say they worked for two of the heads on Mount Rushmore and knew them intimately. At the end of the first book, I have a diary entry from Hay, written just days before he died, that talks about a dream that he had the night before, where he came to the White House and he says, Mr. Lincoln was president. Lincoln gave me some unimportant letters to answer, but I was very glad to have a chance to perform that small service for him. He was very sympathetic about my illness, and I didn't think it at all strange that Lincoln was president, but when I woke from the dream, I was left with an overwhelming feeling of melancholy. So it struck me as a moving passage. And then lastly, a very brief shot of that gut-renovated White House from one end to the other in 1949. So everything we see in the White House today is replicated from the plans and from photographs, but is not, they are not the boards and the ceilings that the other presidents knew. That's the 45-minute version of my story. There's a lot more depth and detail in the book, and I appreciate your interest and your time. And I'm told that if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment, they should go to the mics on both ends of the hall.
Hello.
Yeah.
You mentioned 400 pieces that were purchased by Mary Lincoln, and then you also mentioned the fact that a lot of tourists stole stuff. How many of those 400 pieces actually survived the Lincoln administration?
Well, I couldn't tell you a number, but I know that many of them have, and in the research I did, I saw that one dinner plate sold for about $20,000, which was the 4-year budget for all of the renovations of the White House in the 1860s. They still have some in the White House collection as well, but they were all hand-wrought in New York with French craftsmen. They're quite beautiful, and occasionally I brought out, I guess, for small events, what's left of them. Yes?
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. We're often told that Mr. Lincoln was beset, much bothered and by all the office seekers. But others have said that really this was the way Mr. Lincoln wanted it. He was what we would call a micromanager, and really wanted to keep a close tabs on the patronage situation to improve the status of the Republican Party and make sure the right people got the right jobs. Is that a fair assessment, or is a traditional assessment more appropriate?
No, I think they're both accurate. This was not new to Lincoln. This had happened from every president back to Jefferson, at least. This was the way business was done at the time, and it was very important to hand out these plums to the right people and make the right friends and satisfy the right constituencies. Your presidency was going to rise or fall on that, so that was not unusual. But Lincoln spent so much time on it, you know, on the cusp of a civil war, that a lot of his contemporaries were not happy with it. One Maine senator, Fessenden, said he'd have turned the bayonets on them when they showed up. But Lincoln said no, that, you know, they had worked for him. They wanted to see him. He thought it was important that he did see them. At one point, well, he was exasperated, certainly, by it. It was not a pleasant thing to do. At one time, he told a story about a gentleman who had come asking to be Secretary of State. And when he told him he couldn't be Secretary of State, that position was filled, he asked to be ambassador to the court of St. James. He said, well, no, I'm afraid I can't do that for you either. Then he asked to be made Secretary of the Treasury. No, that's filled also. Then he asked to be made a federal judge. That didn't work. He asked finally to be made the keeper of a lighthouse. He couldn't find a lighthouse for him. And then finally the man asked him, he said, if he could let him have an old pair of pants. So you can imagine the level of pleasure that would be involved in doing that all day, you know, for weeks on end. And it didn't stop. It trickled off but there were always new jobs opening up, always new people coming in and looking for work.
And one more question. You showed briefly one of the New York Fire Zouaves. Could you talk a little bit about the commander of that unit, Colonel Ellsworth, and his association with Lincoln and the impact of his death on the Lincoln White House?
Yeah, Elmer Ellsworth was a young man, I think in his early 20s, 21 or 22, who had also come with Lincoln from Illinois. Lincoln, by the way, was not shy about bringing all of his Illinois cronies with him. There was no sense of impropriety about any of that. But Ellsworth was a young man, also a law clerk with Lincoln, who was kind of a second son to Lincoln, came to Washington with him as a clerk. And when the war began, he went up to New York and recruited these firemen to be a regiment, a regimental entity. They dressed in these exotic uniforms, which were popular at the time, called the Zouave, French Foreign Legion type of uniforms, and came down, brought them down to Washington. They did not fight very well, it turned out, at Bull Run, regrettably enough. But Ellsworth was the first Union casualty. In fact, I think the first casualty on either side in the Civil War. There was a huge Confederate flag flying from an Alexandria hotel that could be seen from Lincoln's office. So you can imagine the indignity of that. You're sitting in the president's office, you look out the window, and there's a huge Confederate flag within sight behind him. So Ellsworth took some men over to Alexandria when Alexandria was taken and went up the stairs to pull that flag down, and was greeted on the stairs by the owner of the hotel, who shot him dead with a shotgun on the stairs. His funeral was held in the White House. It was the first and the last time, I think, that a funeral was held for a soldier in the White House. It almost seemed quaint within weeks of that to have a funeral for an individual soldier. When you think about the fact that there were roughly 700,000 dead in the Civil War on both sides. Anything else? Yep.
I guess if nobody's here. You mentioned Frederick Douglass met, I guess, twice with Lincoln during his term. And then you also mentioned that citizens could walk into the White House and meet with him at any time. Was there a policy that, how are free blacks in general treated when they wanted to visit the White House?
Well, the history of it is that there was never any written rule barring black people from the White House. There was never any formal policy doing that. But as a matter of unspoken lore, everybody knew that you don't go to the White House if you're black. In fact, you don't go to the White House if you're a poor white and you're kind of ragged and you don't have nice clothing. So it was kind of an unspoken, understood rule. When Lincoln was elected, almost they say by osmosis, without any formal declaration or any policy being promulgated, people just showed up at Lincoln's White House of all classes. Gradually, black people started to show up and were let in, could sit and wait in the waiting room to see Lincoln like anybody else. Sojourner Truth, the great abolition preacher of her time, came and sat and waited like everybody else in the waiting room, and was impressed to see two black women waiting there who were let in ahead of the white people who were waiting, which was astonishing to her. So we think of these little things, they're little incremental things to us, but at the time, these were major changes. And Lincoln also admitted black people to these receptions that we saw. Again, started out small, gradual. People were literally stunned to see it, but nobody stopped them. Nobody, said one thing or another about a matter of policy, but just allowed it to happen. And gradually, over time, not only Frederick Douglass, but ordinary black people came to his receptions, to his New Year's Day events, and it was a breakthrough event. One more.
When the Congress was in session, how often did Lincoln go up to the Capitol, and what was his policy? The leaders of Congress or the rank and file members coming to the White House to see him and confer with him, both Republicans, and did he meet with the anti-war Democrats ever at the White House?
Okay, well, he did visit the Capitol occasionally and would sign bills up there in what was called the President's Room in the Capitol building, but rarely. And yes, congressmen, senators, governors met with him often in the White House on both sides. There was a sort of a priority list in terms of rank. Vice President Hannibal Hamlin in the first term, one of the aides said that he doesn't know if Hannibal Hamlin was ever in the White House. He said he may have been there for all I know, but I never saw him. And below that, you know, cabinet members can come in anytime they wanted to. Whoever was waiting, cabinet members would trump them, senators and congressmen. And they would come in, by the way, and interrupt each other's meetings. You know, you might be meeting with the president as a mayor of Toledo or something, and the door would open and a doorkeeper would say, well, Senator Jones is here. Senator Jones would come in, and the mayor of Toledo would go over and wait in a corner until Senator Jones was done. All very informal, rotated around. And I'll just tell you one quick story. Lincoln devised these methods and tools to break off his time with people when he needed to do that, which of course he needed to do all the time. When he was in reception lines, people would try to give him little speeches, and he would put his hand on their back and just kind of shove them along until the next person came along. And John Hay said the speeches were squeezed out of them. But he devised this trick when some small town politician would come to the office, and he knew why this guy was there. All he wanted to do was tell his constituents what he had said to the president and what the president had said to him. So he'd welcome the guy in, he'd shake his hand, and while he was shaking his hand, he'd tell him some little joke, some little one-liner. The guy would laugh at the one-liner, and he'd say, well, good to meet you, and take him to the door, and out he'd go. And he'd leave perfectly happy, because now he could go home and tell everyone how the president told him a joke. Thank you very much.